dawn at Dobodura never arrived gently. It came in sideways through the kunai grass, sticky and bright, laying a wet hand on every tool handle, every patch of canvas, every pair of boots not yet properly awake. Technical Sergeant James McKenna stood at the edge of the hard stand and watched vapor trail off the P-38's wing roots as the first ground crew yanked chocks and the first pilot fastened his harness with the distracted competence of someone who had done it in darkness, in rain, in fear, and in boredom. August 17th, 1943. The Pacific War had entered its middle chapters, the bloody ones where experience learns to be explicit. McKenna had slept badly, which was ordinary. He had dreamed of cable thimbles the size of coins and of the way a control wheel felt when the pilot lifted his palm and said the word he'd been hearing too often. Lag. Not a stall, not a binding, not a jam. Lag. A hesitation small enough to dodge inspection, but big enough to invite death in the seconds when a zero's turn carves free space out of your blind side. The lightning was a fast, brutal twin. 2 Allisons, 2 prop arcs glittering like threats, 2 tails that made every silhouette artist in Japan grind a pencil harder. It could dive like a demon and climb like a promise. What it could not do, not in the circles where the fight turned into a knife, was match a zero's instantaneous response when a stick went left or right in a slashing low-speed merge. Pilots said the P-38 felt heavy in the hands, and that wasn't superstition. It was mechanics. McKenna had chased the complaint through the airframe like a rumor. Bell cranks in spec, pulleys greased, quadrant clear, push rods true, cable runs honest. The manuals said the tension numbers were fine. The inspectors said the numbers matched the manuals. The pilot said 3/8 of an inch. That much slack, somewhere between the wheel and the ailerons, turned a command into a suggestion. Suggestion is the exact wrong pace for survival when an A6M arrives at your 9 o'clock with a pilot who thinks in radians and eats adrenaline for breakfast. He watched Lieutenant Hayes walk to his ship with the swagger of a man pretending not to count funerals. The briefing had been simple and cruel. Sweep, find, bounce, drag east if chased. Hayes had the kind of face that smiled for other people's sake. He joked about how the lightning made you feel like a king until a zero slid inside your crown and bent it. He rapped his knuckles on the yoke before every start as if to wake up a dog. McKenna liked Hayes. Liking a pilot is how mechanics get old fast. The zero had been winning too many of the first turns. Pilots came back gray with the knowledge that the aircraft they loved could lag in the one moment when love needed leverage. McKenna shoved his hands in his pockets and felt the cheap, bright stiffness of a length of piano wire he'd stolen from a busted crate used to lash down a field organ. 6 inches. Not regulation. Not blessed. Not anything but a stubborn idea that wouldn't leave him alone. He had noticed it by accident, and only because accidents are what experienced hands call patterns they haven't named yet. A week earlier, he watched a crew chief adjust cable tension by the book, counting turns on the turnbuckle like a priest counting rosary beads. The numbers lined up. The control wheel felt crisp at rest. Then a pilot taxied and swung hard around a pothole, and the wheel in his hand did not return to center with the same appetite it had shown under the hangar lamp. The cable run had breathed somewhere, expanded under heat, relaxed under load, maybe kissed a pulley cheek and kissed it again on the opposite side to settle in. 3/8 of an inch of slop is the kind of dimension you can only see in motion. On the ground, the system obeyed. In the air, under G and vibration, the slack crawled to the joints like a rumor and waited. McKenna could feel it in his own forearm when he borrowed a cockpit and waggled the wheel. Effort, pause, then response, like a cough trying to pretend it was a breath. Regulations treat airplanes like ideals. Mechanics are forced to treat them like animals. Cables stretch in humid heat. Pulleys grow personalities. Bell cranks pretend to be geometry and then resume being steel with holes under load. The manuals allowed tolerances because the war needed airplanes to be maintainable by teenagers who could follow instructions written by engineers who slept in stateside beds. The manuals were correct about most things and wrong about the thing that was killing men this month. Slack hides in the sum of, okay, you can check 10 joints that are each 0.02 off and swear you have nothing to fear. Then a zero appears and adds all your okay together and calls it your funeral. McKenna wasn't a philosopher. He was a thief of solutions. He had used safety wire to teach a reluctant cowling to stop buzzing at 240 knots. He had paired washers that weren't technically married in any order to spread loads on a bracket that liked to shrug bolts into the grass. He had learned that stiffness in the one place where flex turns timing into tragedy is worth lying to paperwork for, which is why he had the piano wire in his pocket and the decision inside his jaw like a tooth he kept touching with his tongue. The idea wasn't fancy. Bend the 6-inch wire into a Z, notch the ends into a clamp around the cable shank where it met the turnbuckle, and let the spring force preload the cable, just enough to cancel the first shrug of slack when the stick moved. It would act like a tiny auxiliary spring, eating that first 3/8 and returning the system to the world where motion in meant motion out in the same breath. He pitched it to the engineering officer the way a smart mechanic pitches blasphemy, politely, with numbers, and in a place where nobody could confuse dissent with politics. The lieutenant read the page, blinked at the sketch, and said the word that had killed more bright fixes than enemy gunfire. Specifications. The cables were in spec. The control system met design. The pilots had to fly the airplane inside its envelope and stop asking the P-38 to be a zero in a turn fight. McKenna stared at the ceiling and felt 20 pounds heavier. The officer wasn't a fool. He was a hostage to a book. Hostages don't innovate, they enforce. Hayes taxied by and lifted 2 fingers. McKenna nodded without waving, because guilt requires economy. In the hour before first sorties, McKenna made a show of fussing at Hayes's lightning. He checked what he'd already checked. He wiped clean what didn't need wiping. When the crew chief wandered off to scrounge coffee, McKenna slid the panel, exposed the aileron run where the turnbuckle lived like a question mark, and fit the piano wire Z into place with a pair of pliers that had known better days. He tuned it by feel, not by any measurable instrument. Too soft, and it would do nothing. Too hard, and it would preload the system into a different kind of lie. He felt for that exact kiss of force that cancels a shrug. Then he closed the panel and wrote nothing down. He did not tell Hayes. He had learned that pilots fly truer when they believe nothing has changed but their own courage. The runway boiled Hayes as Hayes lined up, the Allisons coughing their way from cantankerous to committed. The P-38 leapt the way twins do when a pilot trusts both hands, left to throttle, right to wheel, and thinks of the air as something that owes him room. McKenna watched the gear fold and counted Mississippi under his breath to keep superstition fed. He told himself he had only given the airplane what every engineer who ever fell in love with elegance intends: immediacy. There is a line between immediate and twitchy. He had walked it with 6 inches of music wire and a prayer to every teacher who had ever told him that feel is a metric, even if paperwork can't print it. The morning sweep turned into a knife fight before the second leg to the east completed. Zeros rose from a strip hidden under a green that would have been beautiful if it hadn't been planning to kill boys. Hayes called bandits. The controller in a tent that called itself a tower sang vectors with the fatal calm of men who aren't allowed to waste adjectives. McKenna stood by the radio shack pretending in the official way to look for a spare gasket. He heard Hayes's voice change key. 2 crossing, low left, 1 high. And then something else, a note of wonder worn down by training into a short word: tight. The wheel had answered like a friend who stops you from falling instead of explaining gravity. Hayes rolled, not with the slow dignity the 38 had been giving them all summer, but with something near to snap without the wobble that makes guns write letters into air instead of sentences into enemies. Pilots lie to themselves about time. Debriefs turn 7 minutes into 3 and 30 seconds into a whole life. The men on the ground measured by watch and by silence. They said 7 minutes. In those 7 minutes, Hayes yoked the Lightning through 3 merges that would have killed him last month. He pressured the first 0 into a flat scissor and refused the bait of the 3rd cycle, popping vertical just enough to cut across the line and plant a burst where the 0's engine turned probability into fire. He rolled with a neatness that made McKenna's hands flex on the wrench he wasn't holding, and the Lightning answered without that little criminal pause. The second 0 tried to drag him down the way instructors had warned, a classic rope-a-dope for a twin with too much wing to waste. Hayes leaned into the roll earlier than doctrine recommended and found the ailerons there with him, not tardy, not late, just there. The 3rd came in hot from high right and ended up a smear that made ground crews stare at the horizon the way farm boys stare at a harvest they don't deserve but need. Radio doesn't carry smiles, but ground crews hear them. McKenna heard the smile under Hayes's breath when he called, "3rd, smoking, he's done." And then the voice went sober again, because sobriety keeps men alive. 2 more in the sun, low on ammo, dragging east. The fight moved where fights go when fuel and bullets make dialogue honest. Hayes returned with holes that looked like stories and a face that looked like a promise not to waste words. He taxied in, killed the Allisons, and sat a second with his hands still on the wheel, as if he wanted to memorize the pose in case memory ever tried to lie to him later. He climbed down, pulled the glove off his right hand, flexed, and said, "You did something." McKenna said, "I washed the windshield." Hayes shook his head and laughed once, the sound of a man who has just outlived a prediction. "She's crisp," he said, and there was the word that would enter the vocabulary of a whole beachhead by noon. Crisp, not sensitive, not touchy, crisp, as if the space between motion and response had been ironed flat. Debrief was disciplined noise, men talking with hands and shoulders, a map littered with grease pencil arrows that meant more to the fingers drawing them than to the colonel nodding over the scene. Hayes logged 3 confirmed. The controller wrote in a calm script that might have been used for recipes in a different life. Pilots who had flown other ships leaned in to listen to Hayes's description of how the roll felt like a vow kept. The wheel's there when you ask, he said. No first shrug, no wobble before the bite. The operations officer raised an eyebrow at McKenna because ground hears ground. You change anything? He asked in a voice that suggested paperwork had feelings and might cry if surprised. McKenna shrugged and said something so innocent even he didn't believe it. We cleaned a few pulleys and settled the runs. It was not a lie, exactly. He had done those things yesterday. Today he had also done the thing he could not say in a room with a major and a clerk and a pilot whose life might depend on that clerk's next memo. He told Hayes on the walk back to the line. Here is the sign of a well-chosen pilot. He did not run to the engineering officer to demand the base be converted into a piano wire factory. He asked for another mission, and he asked McKenna, "How fast can you do it to the other ships?" McKenna said words he would regret and be forgiven for. "Give me the day." Hayes clapped him once on the shoulder and went to find the crew chiefs, who run fighter squadrons the way uncles run family reunions, quietly, with meals and threats. By mid-afternoon, the myth had begun to mature from rumor into technique. A crew chief from the next revetment arrived holding a 6-inch wire with the religious expression of a man who has found a relic. "Like this?" he asked, and McKenna adjusted the Z he had bent into something closer to the spring constant he had guessed by thumb. The crew chief nodded like a student promised a passing grade if he did not embarrass the profession. They moved down the line, panel by panel, avoiding the eyes of officers with clipboards and the one sergeant major who could smell unsanctioned brilliance from 100 yards. The fix took minutes and felt like cheating at a card game in which the prize was somebody's lifespan. At dusk, a memo arrived from engineering with the shape of a warning. "Unauthorized alterations to control systems are prohibited," it said, in the stiff voice of a page that hasn't touched oil. The memo was correct about everything except the day they were living in. Hayes left the memorialization on a table under a coffee cup and flew again with a section that included 2 freshly wired lightnings. They returned with a tone that barged into the tent before they did. Kill claims get argued. Survival doesn't. The squadron had lost nobody that sweep, and the debrief chalkboard looked like respect owed to the math that lives under stories. The next morning, the engineering officer asked McKenna to explain the wire. McKenna did it with the calm of a man who prefers to be fired for the right reason. "We're preloading the cable to eat the first bit of slack," he said, sketching a cartoon of force and travel that recognized stick, cable, quadrant, and aileron as partners instead of strangers. The officer asked what would happen if the wire broke. "Then we're back where we started," McKenna said. He refrained from pointing out that being back where they started had been killing men this month. The officer stared at the sketch and said, "You'll document the installation and give me an inspection checklist," which is how unauthorized fixes get baptized, with the holy water of paperwork written after the sacrament. In the weeks that followed, the fix learned to travel without McKenna. Crew chiefs taught it to crew chiefs with the casual exactness mechanics reserve for rituals that must not be performed fancy. "Bend it here," one would say, marking with a thumbnail the point where the Z must break, "and not here. Notch the clamp so it doesn't creep under load. Tune it by feel. Sweep the wheel left, right in a quick inch. Feel for the shrug to vanish." The Pacific is a geography of islands masquerading as a single war. Techniques rarely spread cleanly across gaps of water and command. This one did, because it fit in a pocket and worked at once. By September, 40 P-38s wore a secret no inspector could spot from 6 feet away, unless he had been told where to look and had the imagination required to admit that a length of wire could shorten a war. Pilots spoke in new words over old fears. Crisp became a noun. Does she have crisp became a question that meant, do I have a friend in the first turn? Kill ratios began to crack and reform, where zeros had been making a mockery of the first merge and dragging lightnings into the long, low, turning fights that killed twins the way tar kills birds. Now the opening seconds had options. A P-38 could roll and bite faster, could spoof the zero with a feint that would have been suicide last month, could refuse to be the slower philosopher in a conversation that allowed only shouts. It did not make the lightning into a zero. It made it into a lightning that answered when called. The change is not semantic. It is statistical. A 3/8 inch delay is not just distance. It is a compound interest on bad timing. Remove it, and the pilot can align the nose with the enemy's future instead of his past. The gunnery spacing tightens. The burst lands. A second pilot in trail feels braver about committing to a high yo-yo because the lead's roll looks like a promise instead of a proposal. Moments like that rescue formation doctrine from superstition. Moments like that keep letters home from changing tense. The zero was still a horror in the vertical if flown by a poet with a sense for sky. Its lightness gave it a first whisper in many dances. But the P-38's new quickness in roll meant it could print ambiguity into the merge, and ambiguity is where a fast twin can buy itself choice. Hayes flew like a man who had been forgiven a debt and meant to pay it forward. He dragged fighters east when the doctrine called for it. He stayed to bite when the math allowed it. He returned to the hard stand with lines of thought still visible in his eyes and talked quietly to kids from farms in Iowa about stick, wrist, elbow, and how much motion belonged in each. McKenna watched 2 wars converge, one in the air with bullets, one on the ground with ideas, and thought that the second, if you were lucky, decided the first. Word reached Lockheed the way wartime word always does, through letters with the poetry boiled off, through officers who nodded at results they hadn't commissioned, through a test pilot who pretended to be curious instead of impressed. The company had already been wrestling with control feel on the J model, with boosted ailerons and geometric improvements queued behind other urgencies. Hearing that a mechanic with a pair of pliers had shut up the worst complaint in a theater for the cost of a handful of spring steel did not offend them. It encouraged them to admit that feel belongs in specifications even when it refuses to be measured at a drafting board. Integration would arrive as a properly engineered answer. Meanwhile, the field fix did what field fixes do best. It carried today across tomorrow without asking for a parade. Data, in war, arrives dirty and late, but men still made charts because charts are how grief learns to count. Operations officers scribbled trends on butcher paper, engagement outcomes before and after crisp, average time to first hit, number of sorties that returned with pilots telling the same story about how the wheel stopped lying, kill ratios that had slumped to 2-to-1 against Americans in certain low-altitude turning fights, bumped toward, even as pilots learned to combine the fix with fresh doctrine, refuse the sustained horizontal, buy your shot in the crossing moment, accept that the P-38's twin booms and mass can be an ally if your role arrives when your sight picture does. The curves on the paper never made claims about causation. They made suggestions, but the suggestions stacked. They became a posture. "We can stay," a squadron leader said in a briefing 2 weeks after the first installation. "We don't have to run the second the scissors starts. We can decide." Decision is a weapon. Engineering officers learned to love the fix because it reduced complaints they could not satisfy with wrenches that fit bolts. The fix controlled hysteresis, the naughty lag in a system with play, without introducing new creep in the zones where metal dislikes being told to be spring. Pilots reported less overshoot and less of that unnerving wobble when you snap through level flight from a hard bank. Ailerons became partners instead of witnesses. The test section measured stick force per G in roll and found nothing that scared a lawyer, which was a kind of miracle. The piano wire was neither visible enough to rust their career, nor invisible enough to be mythology. It was just there, doing the small theft of delay that turns a miss into a hit. Not all reactions were smiles. One stateside memo argued that allowing field mods threatened the integrity of the design and opened the door to disaster if a wire snapped and jammed a quadrant. Mechanics on the line replied with photographs, sketches, and the weary tone of men too busy burying friends to entertain purely imaginary catastrophes. "If it breaks, we're where we were yesterday," one caption read. "If it stays, we're where we'd like to be tomorrow." Another memo warned against uncontrolled innovation. Hayes laughed at the phrase and said, "Buddy, controlled innovation is a drafting room. Uncontrolled innovation is a graveyard." McKenna didn't laugh. He went back to bending wires and tuning by feel and teaching kids to feel for the shrug that should no longer be there. By the third week, the installation had a checklist like anything else worth respecting. Panel off. Visual inspection of runs. Measure baseline deflection at the wheel. Quick 1-inch waggle. Note response onset. Inspect turnbuckle threads for clean engagement. Fit Z-wire with clamp oriented away from pulley travel. Notch lightly to prevent slip. Preload until the first shrug disappears, but the wheel does not self-center when nudged at rest. Safety with a whisper of wire to remind the next pair of hands that someone loved this system enough to talk to it. Panel on. Logbook entry coded as control run inspected and adjusted, because truth is not always the same thing as detail. When detail can get you grounded by men who will be promoted whether you live or not. Evenings at Dobodura smelled like oil and rain arguing. Pilots laid on cots and stared at roofs that leaked in just the one spot they couldn't ignore. Mechanics played cards with the fatal generosity of men who would rather lose money than time. McKenna kept a small notebook with drawings that would have bored anyone who didn't live with wire and doubt. Spring constants guessed, lever arms sketched, cable friction as a line that bent where dust lives. He wasn't designing an airplane. He was designing trust between a wrist and a wing. The difference looks like nothing on paper, and like everything when a zero flashes a white diagonal across your canopy, and you have either a pause or a partner in your hand. Hayes did not become an ace because of a wire. He became the kind of pilot who could let a wire do its best work. In the month after the modification, he flew 12 combat sorties and came home from each with either a claim he hated to file or a memory he hated to keep. He learned to time the roll so that the P-38's mass worked for him, not against. "Don't throw her," he told a younger lieutenant who tried to muscle the ship into the first scissor the way you might try to prove to a bully that you could also lift rocks. "Invite her." The wheel answered the invitation without the stutter that used to send rounds into empty air. Hayes taught men to place the first burst where it would demand the second, not to waste it in the anxious spray that tells your enemy you are behind your own airplane. The fix did not teach patience. It allowed patience to be rewarded. Zeros adapted because pilots on both sides learn from funerals. They tried to reassert their advantage by baiting the lightning into sustained flats, where even crisp roll cannot rescue an airplane built with more metal than its opponent. Sometimes it worked. Sometimes Hayes refused the second cycle, punched a vertical slice, and met the zero on the exit, where the Japanese pilot had not expected a P-38 to arrive with authority at the same time as aim. The shift showed up in small lines on debrief maps. Where arcs had been graceful and long, they grew crisp. Where arrows had traced obedient dying turns, they began to kink with high yo-yo entries and rolling pulls that said the lightning had rejoined the conversation on a subject it had been shouted out of in June. Lockheed's team, miles and worlds away, folded feedback into the P-38J's controls. Boosted ailerons and tighter runs, better bell crank geometry, less cumulative slop. McKenna heard about it in a letter passed from hands that shook only when they stopped working. He folded the letter and put it in the same pocket where the piano wire had once lived. He would never be in a manual. He didn't need to be. He had the sight of Hayes's hand hovering over the wheel after engine shut down, as if reluctant to leave it alone. Men who have worried a long while about a thing learn to touch it gently when it stops hurting. The wire taught other lessons that had nothing to do with steel. It taught that physics does not read orders. It taught that bodies in motion prefer honesty at the joints. It taught that a specification can be accurate and still fail a day, because days have character that charts cannot confess. It taught that an enlisted man with greasy hands and an unblessed idea can push a war one notch toward survivable if he trusts the feedback from the only instruments that never lie: wrists, eyes, and the part of the brain that counts the distance between now and the time it takes for a bullet to travel from a barrel to a fate. Those lessons traveled farther than any single fix, because men who learned them carried them into other shops, other wars, other arguments with paperwork that loved itself too much. By October, counting got easier. Someone in operations tallied saves, a brutal, approximate metric based on sorties where a pilot reported a roll he would have missed last month and a shot he would not have taken or survived without the immediacy he now trusted. 80 to 100, they wrote in chalk and let the rain blur. It was an estimate and a prayer. Numbers like that are both less and more than they seem. Less, because a single human withheld from death is not a digit. More, because each survival bends the arc of a unit's memory, and memory decides tomorrow's nerve. The hack migrated across squadrons the way songs do, imperfectly at first, then with a confidence that made men forget who wrote the first verse. Some installations were too tight. Pilots reported a hint of over-eagerness in the first flick that smoothed with trimming. Others too loose, the shrug still there, the insult intact. Crew chiefs learned to test by putting a hand lightly on the aileron at rest and feeling for the preload through the skin of the airplane. Machines talk if you hold them right. A man from a squadron that had never trusted anyone's fixes but their own arrived with a different wire, thicker and shorter. It looked like a good idea until the clamp chewed a strand and a cable frayed at the worst of all possible times, on the ground, under test. The lesson wrote itself in a curse that turned into a new rule. Use the right wire. The hack was a scalpel, not a hammer. The Japanese adjusted their training memos too, if not their manuals. Reports hinted that 0 pilots were told to avoid the first quick roll when a P-38 had shown itself to be the agile sort, to drag the fight down and away towards strips where gods with flak burned humility into anyone who believed in statistics. The war is a conversation between improvisations. The wire had been ours. The counter-improvisations were theirs. The goodness of a fix can be measured by the quality of the enemy's response. This one earned respect. You could tell by how hard they tried to make us stop talking. Somewhere under the same sky, a stateside test team plugged their own way through the control system, replacing need with virtue. They did not know McKenna and did not need to. The doctrine of feel had won a beachhead in the book. The J model began to roll out with her own answer to slack. Boosts and geometry, springs married to math and then policed by endurance. Pilots who had learned to ask, "Does she have crisp?" found that the new ships did by birthright. They still looked for wire, the way a man who has survived a winter keeps a coat in summer out of habit. They found none and felt relieved, and then sad for reasons they would never write down. Talk drifted forward in time, even as it was spoken. Boys on crates under palm shade argued what the fix might mean for airplanes not yet designed but already jealous in their dreams. If a 6-inch spring can redeem a cable, what can a bellows do for a hydraulic line? If a feel spring here saves a second there, where else has the book traded immediacy for tolerance? The answers would landing gear their way into other wars. F-86 Sabres, when they met MiGs over a different weather, sang with lessons about control harmony written in pencils first blunted at Dobodura. Later, Phantoms wrestled with feel in systems that could shove iron past supersonic in defiance of common sense, and the men with grease understood that a pilot is still a wrist and a spine and a prayer, no matter how many electronics sit beneath his fingers. The wire did not survive into schematics. The idea did. The subtraction of play as the addition of survival. McKenna never got a medal for the hack. He did get a lecture about procedure that he allowed to skate across his face like rain on aluminum. He nodded at the right times because nodding is a lubricant in any hierarchy. Then he went back to work. He trained a kid who believed that specifications were a poem and taught him that poems are fine until the subject bleeds. He sent a letter home that mentioned nothing about wire and everything about food, because mothers don't need to know that their sons are rearranging physics in jungles. He put his pliers in the same place every night and touched them before he slept, as if tools could pray. Hayes left a piece of himself in the war and brought the rest home. He never forgot the feel of the wheel the first time it answered without apology. He told the story with fewer metaphors than you might hope, because men who have paid cash for a result do not mark it up with adjectives. "We took the slack out," he would say, and friends who had never been inside a cockpit would nod as if he had described a household chore. Sometimes he would add, "A mechanic did it," and you could hear the respect fall into the sentence like a coin into a jar that had been waiting for that exact sound. by the time the last P-38 rolled home to a field where boys would stare and men would remember, the fix had moved from rumor to footnote. Footnotes are where history keeps privileges it should have worn on its sleeve. But the pilots who returned with holes where friends should have walked didn't need a footnote to keep McKenna's wire in their pocket of memory. 80 to 100 men, nobody will ever tidy the number into certitude, had lived to write letters, to drink stupid beer, to meet children named for ideas an airplane once made plain. Years turned the Dobodura strip into grasses and stories. The men who had stretched wire between specification and need moved on to other hangars, other arguments with the kind of authority that wants to be right even when it is merely assertive. The lesson refused to be provincial. In Vietnam, control system engineers wrote specifications that included feel explicitly, that demanded spring rates and return forces that matched the human parts of the pilot instead of the tractable parts of the drawing. Fly-by-wire would eventually make piano wire look like a toy, but even in that new world, designers measured the gap between request and response with the same human tape measure McKenna had used. Does the wrist feel lied to before the airplane moves? If yes, fix the lie. If no, guard the truth. At reunions where men wore the same faces in different weather, McKenna and Hayes sometimes found themselves next to a P-38 parked in a museum's borrowed dignity. They would stand near the wing root and let strangers eavesdrop on what sounded like an argument about a small part of a small system on a big day. Hayes would put a hand on the yoke through the open cockpit and move it an inch, the way a man tests the memory of a knee. "Remember the shrug?" he'd ask. McKenna would say, "I remember getting rid of it, in the flat Midwestern that turns pride into something a neighbor can live with." They would look at the cable runs as if the airplane might confess where it had hidden its soul all these years. The docents would clear their throats and quote production numbers and top speeds, and a kid in a baseball cap would ask if the wire was still there. McKenna would grin and say, "Son, it was never supposed to be." And the kid would feel let down by the fact that history looks like omission when it is actually modesty. The story made its way into a manual eventually, not as a directive, but as an example in a preface written by a test pilot with a memory that respected Greece. Field modifications can illuminate design oversights, it said. Feedback loops must include those who live at the joint between control and consequence. The sentence sounded like the kind of thing that gets read aloud at conferences. It was the next best thing to handing every designer a pair of pliers and a hot morning on a strip where the only shade is under a wing and the only justice is immediate. Illicit heroics collect cousins. A navigator once painted a pencil line on a bomb site glass to correct for a bias that a memo had promised would be addressed in the next version. A crew chief kept a parts graveyard in a box labeled "Do Not Open" that contained the exact bolt needed when the motor pool swore there were none left on the island. A radio man stole a battery from a colonel's Jeep because a mission needed voice more than the colonel needed horn. These are not crimes. They are the anthropology of competence. McKenna's wire joined that tribe. Humble, effective, technically impolite, morally inevitable. If you stand today at the place where Dobodura lay, you will not hear Allison's. You will hear wind that sounds like a long exhale under a sky that forgives and forgets unevenly. But if you close your eyes and ask the ground to remember the weight of twin booms and the urgency of boys who had learned to be old in a hurry, You might hear the small sound that changed a fight, the creak of a cable pulling against a spring that shouldn't have been there and absolutely had to be. You might feel, in your own wrist, the difference between a shrug and a yes. You might bless a 6-inch piece of wire bent by a man who knew that lives live in the inch between intention and execution. The Zero's myth survived the war and deserved to. It had been flown by artists and by boys with enough talent to frighten even themselves. The P-38s myth survived too, not because it was perfect, but because it was perfectible. The wire did not make it beautiful. It made it honest. It put the pilot back in the same sentence as the airplane. That is all a mechanic ever really wants. For the tools, he tends to tell the truth to the hands that depend on them. McKenna's gift was not the wire. It was the refusal to accept that a number on a page had to be the end of a thought when the end of a thought could be a coffin. If there is a moral worth carving into a piece of aluminum and hanging over a shop door, it might be the sergeant's version of what philosophers call first principles. When the hand moves, the airplane should move. All else is embroidery. A 6-inch wire made that principle bite in a place where a specification had learned to smirk. The boys who lived because of it did not memorize the principle. They felt it. They felt it in the first flick, in the second shot, in the third minute of a fight that lasts forever if you lose, and 7 minutes if you win, and then come home with a face that will look older forever. In a photograph someone's child will ask about when the museum's lights are tired, and the docent wants to go home, and the veteran stays 1 more minute, hand on the yoke, listening for the shrug that is gone. What that small wire bought was not magic, but margin. The precious inches of time a pilot needs to convert sight into hit and intention into motion. The physics is ordinary. Slack in a linkage stores your command as delay. Preload erases the warehouse where delay likes to hide. In the cockpit, ordinary physics becomes a felt truth that changes decisions. Commit earlier because the roll will meet you. Hold your fire a heartbeat longer because the sight will settle. Refuse the bait of the third turn because you can step out with authority the moment you choose. Spread across 4 squadrons, margin compounds into survivals, and survivals compound into the kind of confidence that teaches a theater to move from coping to fighting. The hack did not give the lightning new lungs. It gave it a clearer voice, and the men who flew it used that clarity to write different sentences in the sky.